Okay, so yes, thank you so much to you and Pete for the invitation to participate in this series. I've enjoyed all the previous talks enormously. I found them all thought-provoking. What I want to talk to you today is an idea that can be called cognitive ecologies and the implications this has for an evolutionary approach to psychology and culture. And in a nutshell, you can capture this idea in the terms put forward by the philosopher Andy Clark, who he tongue-in-cheek formulated his own law, which he says Clark's law, everything leaks. And his suggestion was that everything leaks out into the environment, including what we call mind. And what this means is really we need to sort of reject the last vestiges of a Cartesian model of the mind and allow evolutionary studies of cognition and culture to get to grips with aspects of material culture more fully. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. And the reason why I thought it would be quite nice to do that is because it fits with the overall theme of the series, which is to celebrate the anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man. Now, obviously, that's something hugely worth celebrating as we reflect on how revolutionary Darwin's ideas were, and in some quarters still are. But such anniversaries also provide a good occasion to reflect on how certain ideas may have been modified over time, how some of them have been overturned altogether. And what I want to do is something slightly different, which is it's an idea that hasn't been overturned, but I think could have been and should have, and Darwin himself could have done it. And this concerns our notions of psychological continuity and the kinds of evolutionary perspectives that we hold on mind. And here I think Darwin deviated from some aspects of his own theory in order to bolster the claims that he was making in The Descent. Now, as Freud wrote, the claim that Darwin was defending in The Descent of Man comprised, one of three great outrages upon humanity's naive self-love. And Freud wrote that, the first was Copernicus making clear that we were not the centre of the universe. The second was Darwin robbing us of the idea in The Descent of Man that we were the centre of creation. And the third, and according to Freud, the most bitter blow to humans' narcissism, was Freud's own quite narcissistic suggestion that this was being inflicted by his own work, showing that the ego was not even the master of his own house, i.e. that humans couldn't even claim a privileged position with respect to the working of their minds. So, this really was something major, as recognised by Freud, that, we really were toppled from the pinnacle of creation by Darwin's work. And so in The Descent of Man, and also in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, which came out the following year in 1872, Darwin used various lines of evidence to demonstrate that our place in nature, not only in terms of physiological and morphological continuity, but also psychological continuity, that there was a difference, as we all know. He famously said, it's a difference of degree and not kind. And I think it's in his efforts to emphasize psychological continuity that I think that Darwin sort of slightly deviated from his own theory, because he ended up accepting a dualist, Platonic, Cartesian view of mind. And that enforces a division between the organism and the environment, which otherwise Darwin was at pains to emphasize, the mutuality of organisms and environment. So this might seem odd at first to make this claim, because by affirming humans as part of the animal kingdom, Darwin was undermining Descartes' view that, lacking souls, unlike specially created humans, animals were mere automata, that they didn't feel pain, they were just making funny noises if you sort of trod on them. And so he sort of was rejecting a dualism between man and animal in that sense. And, in other words, he was rejecting this anthropocentric view of humans as the pinnacle of creation. And this is the point where it is obligatory for everyone who has ever studied baboons, as I have, to wheel out this quotation from Darwin's M Notebook, where we say, he who understands baboon would do more for metaphysics than Locke. We will understand more about the evolution of ourselves and our minds if we look to our primate relatives than we will to look into the work of philosophers like John Locke. And I think it's certainly true that Darwin rejected those dualisms of animal versus human. And in his work on natural selection and in The Origin and in other areas of The Descent of Man, he was rejecting these divisions between organism and environment. But there is also evidence in his M Notebook to suggest that he nevertheless took as read this kind of standard Platonic concept of mind that persists until this day. So he acknowledges implicitly that mental phenomena are private and internal, and that all experience of the world and our actions in it are mediated by representation. So he says, Plato says in Phaedo that our necessary ideas arise from the pre-existence of the soul and are not derivable from experience. Read Monkeys for pre-existence. So again, he takes us back to looking at our ancestry, and this is where we will find the basis of our minds. But he takes on board Plato's, and that's the other beardy man there is Plato. He takes on board Plato's notions of what a mind is. And so he's retained a Cartesian picture of the mind that is both retains an anthropocentrism. It's still anthropocentric because it's based on a human understanding of mind, and it is still dualist. And that view goes against Darwin's own emphasis on the mutualism between organism and environment. And clearly he did so because this was the dominant view of the human mind. And I don't think he was necessarily interested in mind as such, rather that he was interested in establishing continuity. But I think that this kind of initial move and subsequent elaborations of Darwin's view in areas like, Donald Griffin elaborating on things like in cognitive ethology, they've kept this Cartesianism alive. And we may no longer be substance dualists. We do not think we have some kind of non-physical mind stuff that floats through and is separate from our body stuff. But the assumption of an internal private mind that is inside us has been subject to very little criticism in mainstream psychological circles. And ignored in this way, internalism has sort of remained intact and more or less unquestioned. So we've exorcised the ghost from the machine, but we haven't eliminated all elements of a Cartesian conception of mind. So although the mind is now material and to some extent considered as mechanical, it continues to remain bound securely within our skin and within our skulls. And that's a dominant metaphor that you see in cognitive psychology, and you certainly see it in certain schools of thought in evolutionary psychology, most prominently the Santa Barbara school, where the mind is the brain is a computer, and cognition is computation. And that doesn't present a very biological picture when you think about it. As the ecological psychologist Harry Heft has pointed out, it means psychology is really based on a flawed ontology. We're basing our understanding of our minds on inanimate machinery and not on living systems. And I think this is worth, this might seem sort of a quite esoteric worry to have, but I think it is important because such a view informs movements such as transhumanism. And I think that's a stance that deserves, some consideration, and it raises wider concerns, because with an internalist computational idea of the mind, you can see how the idea that we can evolve beyond our current physical limitations take hold. That's the kind of notion of transhumanism. If your brain is just a computer, then it's easy to see how your mind could be uploaded to the cloud or to a new robotic body. If your body just is a mechanical device, then it's easy to see how it could be upgraded to become ever more productive. So transhumanism worries me a bit because it sees us as these kind of autonomous machines that are there to be improved on, using resources that come at a cost to both the sustainability of the planet and the health of other species, the health of the planet as a whole. And, as living organisms, as Darwin showed us, we should recognize that these kind of transhumanist ideals are foolish. We would be these kind of perfected human intellects living on a dead planet. So I think we need to get away from this idea, because it's not doing us any good, as we all know, to our cost in terms of things like climate change. So it's true that other pictures of the mind are possible. So there has been this dominant Cartesian view, that this narrative that has sort of dominated our understanding of psychology. And then there's also been a kind of shadow narrative that's always been there behind and has never managed to get purchase. And I think it's kind of an interesting issue as to why don't these ideas gain the same kind of purchase as this Cartesian view does. And I think it's often to do with the fact that we just are kind of Cartesian in the way we use our everyday normal language. It's very easy to fall into that way of talking. So other pictures are possible, and there have been continuous efforts to think differently about the mind over the course of the 20th century. Most, Gilbert Ryle in philosophical terms is the most famous here. as he says here, he wants to throw a brick at Brian McGee for, using the word inside, that there is something inside us, a private mental realm that is distinct from the outside world. Okay, that there are two worlds, a mental one that we inhabit, and the physical environment. And other individuals have said, no, we are not these isolated individuals separated from the world, these subjects directed to a world of objects that we have to struggle to understand and relate to. We are always and already in the world. And there are various people that you can identify who have had this were part of this shadow narrative. So you've got early pioneers like the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who famously wrote a very famous book called Steps to an Ecology of Mind that was very interesting and was trying to get at this. You have the experimental psychologist James Gibson, the father of ecological psychology, who, said that what animals are doing is attuning themselves to the affordances of the environment, the possibilities for action that environments afford, whether for good or ill, and animals have to therefore act in the world in order to perceive. And so perception and action are part and parcel of the same thing, and you don't need to have a highly mediated representational view of the world in order to act effectively and productively within it. The Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who's here, was instrumental in the rise of what's known as cultural historical activity theory. And again, his notion was that we become the kinds of Cartesian individuals we can be because at times we are those kinds of Cartesian individuals who can think thoughts about things about outside the world. But Vygotsky's point was that comes about through a social process, that we are only those kinds of individuals because at base we are fundamentally social. And you can also include many of the pragmatist philosophers like John Dewey here, who can also be included in this kind of the modern synthesis, if you like, of cognitive ecology approaches. From the perspective of organism environment mutuality, he said, we can apply this to our understanding of humans and our psychology, because we are not in our environments in the way that marbles in a box are. We are in our environments in the way that plants are in soil. Those environments nourish us and feed us in various ways. So you can remove a marble from a box and it'll still be a marble. But if you remove a plant from a soil, the plant will die. So we are always embedded in our environments, and those environments are part and parcel of what allow us to behave in the ways that we do, and they are instrumental in creating the kind of psychological beings we are. And I think, this always strikes people as very, very odd, but we can also include Skinner here as well. Skinner's radical behaviorism gets included here. And I say this as an unashamed behaviorist, because this was a similar attempt to reconceptualize psychology along pragmatist rather than Platonic and Cartesian lines. So this, weirdly, I think this was the true revolution. We always talk about the cognitive revolution, the vanquishing of behaviorism and a return to understanding mind. But in fact, that's just a return to the sort of Cartesian psychology that I think we need to get rid of, that hampers our understanding of ourselves. So this is Skinner was attempting much the same as these early pioneers of a cognitive ecology, where here the mind is something that is public and situated and relational and participatory, and it's not this internal, intellectual, individual, private thing. Brains do not store and manage information. They are changed by experience, and this is part of the process by which individuals calibrate and recalibrate to the environment, or to use Gibson's metaphor, attune to and resonate with the environment. So, it's a fallacy to say that Skinner said there wasn't things going on inside people and animals. They were things that physiologists were there to find out about. He was interested in behavior. And there's a nice quote by these two ecological psychologists, Palatinus and Michaels, who say, the consequence of personal experience is not that the old animal has new knowledge, but that you have a new animal that knows better. So it's a process of change and calibration. And it's the way in which this comes about is what he called transdermal, that you have antecedent, a behavior, and a consequent, and those things all go together. The individual unit of analysis is the organism in its environment. You don't separate the two and treat mind as autonomous and independent of the environment. So more recently, there have been these renewed efforts to unseat this internalist view and demonstrate that the kind of prevailing picture is not the only way that we can think about minds. And these dissenting views, these more recent dissenting views, fall under the umbrella of what's called 4E cognition. So the 4E stand for the notion that cognition is embodied, inactive, extended, and embedded. And I'll explain what that means in a little bit more detail later. But what they're really getting at is, although there's a whole slew of books there, and although there are some important differences between the different schools of thought that are encompassed by 4E cognition, and there are actually even more 4Es now. They can't even be characterized by just these four words. There are many, many variants on this now. But they share in common, all of these variants do share in common this core notion that the evolutionary origins of mind and cognition are to be found in the control of perception and motor action in a dynamic environment. So brains evolved first and foremost to control bodies. They're not primarily to think deep thoughts about things. They are there to control a physical body. So as a consequence, you can't divorce cognition from its bodily and environmental contexts. And as a consequence of that, it becomes mistaken to attribute cognitive processes to brains alone. Rather, what we consider a cognitive process has to be understood as a contextual relational phenomena in a kind of Darwinian mutualistic way that reflects the nested arrangement of brains and bodies and environments, that cognitive processes spread beyond the brain into the body and out into the world. And interestingly, Darwin himself, the most psychological of Darwin's books is his book on earthworms, which might sound weird. But in that book, what he writes about really fascinatingly, that's where he talks about how earthworms churn up the soil and create their own, like it's always talked about in terms of niche construction. But he also talks about how earthworms can respond to the affordances of their environment. He doesn't put it in those terms, but you can read it in that way. And it's actually about the psychology of earthworms as much as it is about niche construction. So he kind of did come back to this, even though he only did it in response to earthworms rather than human beings. So what this view gets at in many ways is that, and I think this is what makes it interestingly evolutionary, there are many examples of how species can solve problems more cheaply by being built in the right way, rather than evolving energetically expensive brain tissue. And we all know that evolution is a thrifty process. So this bug, for example, here has a gearing mechanism in its legs. And these gears synchronize the movement of the back legs so that it can perform exquisitely timed, highly propulsive jumps. And it does so more precisely than neural control of its legs could achieve. So it's accomplished and solved this problem of how to propulsively jump in a coordinated fashion by evolving the right kind of body rather than evolving more neural tissue and controlling its body by cognitive means or neural means. If you've ever wondered why a seahorse looks so boxy and square, it's because a square tail enables anchoring to marine plants more firmly than a circular one. And again, that reduces the need for fine motor control. And we all know how expensive brain tissue is. So these ways in which being built in the right way means that you can solve a problem that would otherwise need to be solved cognitively. So often we look to, when you see bees and other simple creatures doing things that seem very, very impressive and complicated, one of the things that we can do is look to see how they are built, how their bodies are put together, because that can often explain as much about what they are achieving in the world than anything that's going on in their brains. Now, it's not saying that brains don't matter, but it's saying that brains and bodies can work together to produce more effective solutions and cheaper solutions from an evolutionary perspective. Another relevant finding in this domain, and I think this is really fantastic work on what's called peripersonal space, which shows that the boundaries of our bodies are kind of mutable and can expand to control, to include tools. So this is talking about what, in terms of what's known as the body schema. So your body schema is just this kind of, when you shut your eyes, it's what allows you to know where your arms are in space without you having to look. It's the kind of involves aspects of proprioception, and it's a sort of, we are born with it, it's innate, it's a sense of your body in space. And what this work by Iriki and Maravita showed is that the activity of a tool using monkey's brain, if you record it from the interparietal cortex, which is where bodily and visual stimulation is integrated, in this area of the interparietal cortex, they're what are called bimodal neurons, and they respond to both somatosensory information, so physical stimulation of the body, and to visual information. So there are bimodal neurons that respond to the stimulation of the hand, which is called the somatosensory receptive field, and there are visual stimuli, and these neurons will also respond to visual stimuli near the hand, which is called the visual receptive field. So what you see here is before tool use, you've got the visual receptive field just includes the monkey's hand. It only responds to things close to the monkey's hand. After the monkeys have had 5 minutes of practice raking in food items using a tool, the bimodal neurons whose somatosensory receptive field corresponds to the hand show a change in their visual receptive field. It elongates and extends to include the entire length of the tool. So the objects placed within the reach of the tool now stimulate the visual neurons, whereas previously those visual neurons were only stimulated by things that were near the hand itself. So in a sense, the rake has become part of the monkey's reaching system. The visual receptive field is extended to the end of the tool. So to produce this effect, the monkey has to actively use the tool to obtain an item like food. If you just hold the rake passively, as you did there, that has no influence on the receptive fields of neuron populations. So these tools, as we use them, become an integral part of our bodies. And you can get a sense of this yourself. If you get a pencil and poke someone in the arm with it, what you experience is not your fingers holding the pencil. You experience the end of the pencil poking a person. That's where you are situated. And when we use tools regularly and habitually, and when we play sports and all these kinds of things, this peripersonal space expands to include those tools. So there's work now, a very nice paper in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews that goes into all this and includes work on humans. So we know this happens in humans as well. So I think these kinds of things, this understanding of being able to take action in the world is important in terms of how it can help solve our problems prior to needing a big brain. So species like Australopithecus sediba, I find very interesting because they have this weird, unique and previously unknown combination of archaic and advanced traits. And so the study of the Australopithecus sediba's hand, it has changes in the thumb that are usually associated with tool making, but it still has these kind of curved fingers that suggest it might have climbed trees. So it seems like it's potentially capable of making tools. It's potentially able to still climb up in trees. It's kind of flexible in that way, but it has a very small brain. So you've got these dexterous hands that come before large brains, and there's no evidence of tools associated with Australopithecus sediba, but it's clear that it was highly dexterous, and dexterous hands can do a lot. Equally, the thrifty nature of the evolutionary process means that strategies for exploiting already existing structure in the world and manipulating such structure should be selected relative to those that use the same outcome via the use of more energetically expensive internal mechanisms, neurally derived mechanisms. So Andy Clark calls this the 007 principle, and another worker in evolutionary and embodied cognition, Mark Rowlands, calls it the barking dog principle. So his thing is like, on the basis like, why buy a dog and then bark yourself? If there's structure in the environment that you can exploit for free, so to speak, then why go to the trouble of evolving particular morphological or neurological structures to allow you to reproduce that inside yourself, so to speak, when you can just use the world itself? So my favorite example of this, I think, is the mud skipper. So this is a fish that can come out of the water and is able to feed on land. But when it does so, it can't simply suck in floating food as it does when it's in the water. So what it does is it brings a mouthful of water with it onto land, and it sort of squirts it out at high speed and then sucks it back in again rapidly at high pressure. And in effect, it produces a tongue made of water that can grab food, much like a gecko's tongue grabs insects. And the analogy here is, we can also exploit structure in the environment in the same way, incorporating all manner of external tools and environmental resources to supercharge our own abilities, to turbocharge them, that we can go beyond what our biological endowments in terms of morphology and brain power provide us by exploiting what's available in the environment. So human abilities to use tools and other forms of material culture, public and written language, all of these leverage our cognitive abilities so that we can achieve more than our biological brains can achieve alone. But rather than these human, social, cultural, technological practices, whatever you want to call them, representing a discontinuity between humans and other species, I think they arise from a deep continuity across the animal kingdom to actively exploit and manipulate the environment in fitness-enhancing ways. And what this means in a broader sense is, if that's true, and I think it is, cognitive capacities can't be linked to the brain alone because they are not localized there. And again, this shadow narrative can come back in. So Charles Sanders Peirce, who was, again, a pragmatist, chums with William James and the like, he wrote about his inkstand because he objected to this notion of localizing psychological abilities to particular areas of the brain. So he wrote about how, well, a psychologist, he sort of said, a psychologist cuts off a lobe of my brain, and when I find I cannot express myself, says, you see, your faculty of language was localized in that lobe. And he said, no doubt it was so. And if you'd filched my inkstand, I should not have been able to continue my discussion until I had got another. Yea, the very thoughts would not come to me. So my faculty of discussion is equally localized in my inkstand. So he was making a point about, the fallacy of trying to locate particular functions to highly specific areas of the brain. But he was also making a wider point that we extend our cognition out into the world, and inkstands can be equally seen as part of a faculty of discussion as whatever is going on in your brain. So this is a kind of slide I really hate and would never usually use. But this is really just to show that rejecting a kind of internal view of cognition is not an all or nothing enterprise. There are a variety of positions that people can take, that one can take, and some are more conservative than others. And there's, a lot of debate over these distinctions and the relative plausibility of the various positions. Some are concerned with what you could call collective behavior, socially distributed behavior. So Edwin Hutchins is the classic work. Cognition in the Wild is one there. Aspects of enactivism and extended minds are more concerned with sort of individual minds as opposed to collective activities. And then you have this notion of embedded mind. So in the enactive and extended mind idea, it's sort of like the mind is either unbounded altogether or can extend out into the world, and we incorporate those things into ourselves, much like the rake is incorporated into the monkey's body. And we can literally consider those things part of the individual mind. And then the embedded mind thing is more like the distributed cognition view, which is to say a lot of our tools are socially produced, they are collective, and so they cannot be incorporated as part of an individual mind, but we can consider them essential scaffolds that we cannot function without. And so we can, in that sense, say that cognitive systems are embedded in an environment without which they could not function. So in all cases, they all resemble each other in that way. They all view cognitive processes and minds as fundamentally and intimately tied to the manipulation of environmental resources, various props and scaffolds with varying feedback, feed forward and looping effects. So the environment is not simply a source of input to the cognitive system, it's a necessary component. And Lambros Maliforis, he is someone who has written similarly in terms of archaeology, applying this to the archaeological record, that you can understand something about material artifacts, not by looking at them as the products of mind, but as treating them as part of the mind itself. So if we think about human evolution and what we have achieved over the course of time, what we seem to have done is just extend our capacities in various kinds of ways. So cooking and food preparation are widely acknowledged to have transformed hominin physiology, alter selection pressures on jaws, teeth, guts, by extension our brains. So we've reduced the demands of eating by chopping and slicing, heating, soaking, pounding, fermenting, boiling, roasting, all these kinds of things. And these reduce demands on digestion. So with the result that energy previously needed for expensive gut tissue can be diverted and apparently into brain growth. So this, we're now obligatory cooks. It's almost impossible for humans to subsist on a diet of raw food alone. So we can see that what we have done is kind of offloaded the work of digestion out into the environment. So we can think of cooking as a way of extending our digestion and using technology and tools in order to save us the work that our biological bodies would otherwise have to do. Interestingly, I think breast milk is an interesting issue here, because you can see this as digestion extended to other creatures besides ourselves. So there are oligosaccharides in breast milk that babies themselves cannot digest, but they can be digested by the bacteria in the baby's gut. And those bacteria form particular kinds of biofilms that aid with digestion, and they also help sort of seed a healthy microbiome for when the baby shifts to a more varied diet. So again, mothers are producing milk not just for their babies, but for the bacteria in their babies' guts. We can see various kinds of tools and weapons and hunting tools, things like atlatls, spears, various kinds of javelins. Anything you throw in this kind of way can be seen as a way of extending our muscle power. Bows and arrows being the kind of most effective way of doing that in terms of these kinds of hand-powered tools. So we extend our muscle power by using tools in this way, and you can see that in declines in robusticity in bones and muscles as we become to rely on these things: plows, hoes, all the kinds of tools that we use to extend our biological capacities in terms of muscle. We don't have to build bigger muscles, we make better tools. And clothing, obviously, can be seen as extended pelts. So we don't have to go. We can use the pelts of other creatures to keep ourselves warm, and don't have to go to the trouble of evolving hairier pelts ourselves, given that we evolutionarily lost them. So all these things, we are extending ourselves morphologically and physiologically, and the same goes for things like writing systems. So writing systems can function as a kind of extended form of memory. And of course, these have effects that go beyond what humans without these capacities could do. So what biological memory seems to do, it seems to be a way of which the animals are trying to integrate the past into the present that allows animals to go on effectively. That's the point of it. Okay, it's not about having a perfect recall. It's only with the advent of writing systems that we think that's what memory is for, that it's for recording events in a manner that freezes them in that moment and can be accurate. So the the notions of memory that we have as some kind of store that you can retrieve and call on comes about, it seems, by the fact that we have created physical memories in the world that we can read off. So once you can freeze memories in this way, it alters what memories are and can be. And so we need to kind of be careful about whether what we see as, the analogies we use of saying, oh, a memory is like, a filing system or a writing system. Maybe the reason why we think that is because we originally had it in the world and we've taken that and put it back in our heads. And that's not what biological memory is like or for at all. And it doesn't seem to be. So, there are various other ways in which that people have, talked about this form of cognitive offloading. All these ways in which we can do things that we wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do, because by putting them in the world, we make our task easier and less onerous on our biological brains. And I think this is a paper that really kind of brings these things home to me. It's by Oscar Berger, and it's looking at industrial energy use and human life histories. So what you've got here is mass along the bottom, log per capita energy use in watts on the y-axis, and there's field metabolic rates and basal metabolic rates for all mammals, and then human industrial populations sit here. And what they did, and so they say, we can look at fossil fuel energy, which is what industrial humans use. We can look at fossil fuel energy as this massive form of extrasomatic energy. We are exploiting energy outside our bodies, and then they use this to work out how big we would have to be if we were a primate of the size that had a basal metabolic rate of this size, of this magnitude. And what they show is that we would we are effectively, in the most industrial humans are not, they use the per capita use of metabolic, megawatts of energy would be the equivalent of the metabolic rate of a 92,500 kilogram primate. And it would be, that's not even big enough, that primate there. That's actually twice the size of an adult sperm whale. But I just couldn't find a good picture of a sperm whale. So these are, these are, here you can see that industrial humans have kind of become extended in these ways, that they are these gigantic primates in effect. And when you look at birth rates, the idea that we only produce in highly industrial societies 1.6 offspring, it's like, oh, this is below replacement. This is very maladaptive. But if you work it out in life history terms, that's precisely the number that a 92,000 kilogram primate should produce. Because of, according to life history theory. So it's maybe not so maladaptive after all if you take this more distributed view. Even the committed cognitivists may benefit from thinking about how we distribute our minds into the world. These papers by David Landy and Robert Goldstone are very interesting. So what they did was look at how equations and how we solve them can be affected by the spacing between the numbers. So normally, this is kind of how we normally write something where you have addition and multiplication. And if you write it differently and space the operators differently, this now looks like you need to add the 2 and the 3, and the multiplication of the 3 and the 4 is more difficult to process. And what they showed is that when you give people these kinds of things and ask them to solve whether they are looking at a valid or an invalid equation, you just have to look at the sensitive trials. The insensitive trials are basically their controls. And you can see that when you make the operators spacing inconsistent with what would normally be presented, people's accuracy goes down. And the point they wanted to make here was that we tend to think of equations as symbolic, and we risk modeling this process as a highly conceptual one, when clearly aspects of it are actually perceptual. It's how the equations, the spacing between the digits, influences our ability to solve those problems. So it's not as though the environment and how the environment is arranged is irrelevant to even highly cognitive tasks. So, this, oops, what's gone here? Something's gone funny here. This view, I think, is, as Andy Clark says, human brains make the world smarter so we can be dumb in peace. But we're then faced with what Clarke has called the paradox of active stupidity. To be dumb in peace, we've had to evolve very large, very smart brains, and that would seem to go against this whole idea of the barking dog principle. So I don't think there's any contradiction, because it makes us focus on the fact that we can look at when did we need internalist strategy, and is an externalist strategy going to suffice? So when environments are highly changeable and unpredictable, or when animals are long-lived and can expect to experience a variety of conditions for their lifetime, externalist strategies of the kinds we've been talking about may well be disadvantageous, and internal mechanisms that increase an organism's flexibility in the face of change may be more important. But what's striking in the human case is the high level of investment in both internalist, i.e. growing big brains, and externalist strategies. And I think this raises interesting questions of how the two relate to each other and the nature of selective forces that gave rise to this unusual combination. And I think this interrelation is a real question of interest, rather than simply assuming that more brain means more ability to learn per se. And that's a question that is all there for the taking. So there's just two final things I want to say. Is I think that this externalist view can help us with things like understanding causality. So this example has arisen a few times over the course of the seminar series. The idea that humans don't have a full causal understanding of their cultural inventions, and this interpretation, that when you show that people don't fully understand causality in terms of how a bow and arrow works and how the different parts have different effects, is a refutation of the cognitive niche hypothesis, and is support for the cultural niche hypothesis. Because the cognitive niche hypothesis says humans use cause and effect reasoning to solve their problems. And Steven Pinker, has said, these inferences are played out internally in mental models of the world, governed by intuitive concepts of physics, biology, psychology, etc. And this capacity allows humans to invent tools, traps, and weapons. And these arise by mental design and are deployed, tested, and fine-tuned by feedback in the lifetime of individuals. And this cognitive versus cultural niche is put to the test, and I understand why that is. It's good to have these competing hypotheses. And the cultural niche is the idea is that, well, no, a gene culture co-evolutionary process produces cultural products, and no single individual could invent those in their lifetime. And I think the cultural niche hypothesis is really getting at, in my view, a rejection of the Cartesian view of mind that's used by proponents of the cognitive niche hypothesis, which rests on this internalist, individualistic, intellectualized view. It reflects the scientific picture we've created of the mind. So as Ed Hutchins has said, much of what cognitive sciences have been modeling is not actually cognition itself. It's the formal symbolic tools and systems that human cognition has itself created and is now adapted to. So computational models of the mind are themselves cultural symbolic tools that we're studying. And what the Hadza study could be said to show is that bowyers are not able to articulate their understanding of causality in terms of required of a Western scientific understanding of physics, which is what cognitive psychology's intuitive physics boils down to. Instead, you can look at it from an ecological perspective, where the cognitive system is not the individual bowyer, but the bowyer plus the bow and arrow, recall the extended system of macaques, where the bowyer's body schema likely extends to include the arrow, and where understanding of causality emerges in the action of its use. So there is a direct experience causal connection between the bowyer and the bow as an extended cognitive system, and it is that system that understands causality in a direct, physical, pragmatic way, not in an indirect, disembodied, representational way. And I think what matters here is producing a bow that affords shooting an arrow in ways that serve the Hadza goals. So we can reconfigure this not as a rejection of the idea of a cognitive niche per se, but of a model of mind that confines biological and psychological processes to skin and skull, when the more evolutionary approach will be to acknowledge this fuzziness of boundaries of the body and the cognitive system and incorporate material culture more fully into our models of theories as an active participant and not simply as the mind's product. And I think if that strikes you as a bit sort of not a real understanding of causality, I think it's because we live in a niche where the kinds of representational knowledge we gain through written symbolic systems is given this massively high premium. And I think, I won't go into this, but again, this shows a resemblance to the kinds of things that you see in Piaget's A not B task, where the idea that you can produce these manipulations that help babies pass, that change their posture, add weights to their arms and legs. I couldn't find a picture of a baby lifting weights. And what these manipulations do when a baby is reaching is, the idea is that a baby has object permanence. It's the cognitive factor in their brain. And if they have object permanence, they should be able to reach and always find an object. And what you can show is if you, during these tasks, take the delay away, stand the baby up, give the baby weights, the baby can pass even though nothing in its brain has changed, only its body has. And the idea is that it's the baby as a whole that has an object concept, not just its brain, that we need to think in these more embodied ways. And then just finally, I want to consider one final way which we could rid ourselves of the anthropocentric Cartesian view once and for all. And that's to recognize that material culture can generate its own form of agency that acts with and through us. So we assume that technology and tools always do our bidding, that we act on the world with our technology, but we assume it can't exert similar effects on us. And if we shift our perspective, instead of seeing humans and their artifacts, we can see actors in a network where we don't differentiate between human actors and inanimate objects. And this is something that we're not comfortable with because agency and intention are seen as properties of humans alone, which is another Cartesian hangover, I think, another divide between the humans and the world. Because we've created this division between humans and the social world, and then we can't really deal with it. So there, I'm going to, we know about hostile architecture as a source of moral agency in the world. Okay, you can prevent people from sleeping on things by making it impossible for them to do so, and that has more effect than a sign. And so we use these things to morally enforce what we think is right in a city. Ian Hodder has written very nicely about the houses at Catahoyuk, which were built of smectic clays, which expand very quickly with water and show very high shrinkage when dry. So Catahoyuk is this, one of the earliest and largest settlements, permanent settlements, sort of a town, more complex social arrangements seen between people than previously. It's about 8,000 to 9,000 years old. And the relationship that Ian Hodder says here is that relationships between the molecules in clay produce relationships between people in society at Catahoyuk, as they had to work together to solve the problem of collapsing walls, because they would build them when wet, they'd dry out and then start falling over. So people had to make wooden posts to hold them up. They covered the walls in plaster. They made like double thickness walls. Then there was this switch to making bricks from sandier clays. So then they used molds for those. The bricks had to be laid out to dry. They had to be made ahead of time. Making stronger and more stable bricks involved more labour and work. So people got increasingly trapped by bricks. Digging of clay pits also led to a burst in proliferation of Phragmites reeds, which lowered the water table. And so that engendered a whole new set of things that people had to do that resulted in cumulative culture. But humans were forced to invest more to stay in the same place. And they were forced to do so because not that objects were having agency like in the same way as people, but because they were reacting to and acting on people in these various ways. They were pulling people into these relationships of care and concern. And we know this, again, you can see this in the 20th century, where the advent of many labour-saving devices did anything but save labour. They just created more work from others. They led to new standards of cleanliness and hygiene, and that pushed women into more work and not less. So this isn't a simple environmentally deterministic thing I'm saying here, but there's clearly a reciprocal relationship between the possibilities that new technologies create and the demands made by how people respond to those and how new cultural norms emerge. I think that, this is a paper about kids wearing nappies. So if you look at babies walking naked, wearing a disposable nappy and wearing a cloth nappy, this is the baby's, like a baby walking along a step, the width of steps they take and how well balanced they are. This is a baby without a nappy on. And when you put it in a disposable nappy, or when you put it in a cloth nappy, you're sending it back in time, basically, by a baby wearing a cloth nappy walks as though it has 50 days less walking experience. You send it back in time to an earlier period of development because the cloth nappy itself impedes the walking process, and the baby then has to adjust to that. So even these kinds of things exert a form of agency and affect the developmental process in ways that we often aren't attentive to. So all of that may sound like a strange idea, but to quote Andy Clark here, on reflection, is it any weirder than the very commonplace idea we have that it's the activity of this kind of brain meat in our head that realizes all that matters about human cognition? So I think we need to start getting our hands dirty, taking the material world more seriously, treating culture and cognition as a distributed process where material objects can act on us, through us, and with us. And with that, well done to Darwin, happy anniversary, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Lou. Thank you very much. While people are thinking about their questions, let me ask one thing, and it's related to evolution of human distinctiveness. You kind of touched on a couple of things that I'm going to mention, but I wonder if you could elaborate. So if we talk about emergence of human distinctiveness, one particular explanation, it focuses on increasingly unstable and variable environment during Pleistocene that put premium on social learning, on cooperation, and when you want to cooperate with other people, you probably need the theory of mind, and you also need some kind of an inner eye. So I wonder how all these ideas, because I don't think you mentioned cooperation and some of other things that I just listed. I wonder if you can elaborate how you view this approach and how it matches with what you've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I think often there's an assumption that you can't do these things, you can't coordinate and solve certain problems with others unless you have a well-developed theory of mind. And I'm not entirely sure that's true, in a sense that I'm kind of in line with people like Celia Hayes and Chris Frith on this score, which is I think often these things are quite recent inventions that have come about through a particular highly linguistic, highly literate kind of form of society, and where we then assume that these things are necessary in order to achieve certain goals. And so the thing I always say, I've worked on like a number of species of non-human primates. I've also done a little bit of stuff on chimpanzees, and they don't, there's no evidence that that monkeys have theory of mind. The evidence for chimpanzees is a bit shaky, but the alternative to not having a theory of mind is often presented as like, if you have a deficit of theory of mind, then, you show these kind of autistic kind of qualities. And, if you watch monkeys, they don't have theory of mind, but they're certainly not behaving in a kind of autistic way. They are able to, they know what to do. They know that they can do these. They know how to do these things. They may not know that they are doing them. They may not project their mental states to others, but they know how to behave with others. And those embodied forms of social engagement, I think, can get you quite a long way. And I also think that there's a book coming out by Johan Lind, Magnus Enquist and Stephen Gerlander, hopefully this year, where they show the immense power of associative learning and how far you can get with that. And there are other people using simulation studies to show that what is thought of as episodic memory can be reconfigured as forms of associative learning that pick up on regularities in the environment. So I think sometimes we go for those arguments because they flatter our idea of ourselves rather than those are actual facilities that you need. And you've got a model where you talk about social coordination, and you use that social coordination and you say this is a proxy for individual cognitive abilities. And in a way, you don't need to make that assumption. You can just say, the social coordination is itself a distributed process across, and that that collective can achieve more than an individual mind. You've kind of added the extra assumption in there that you don't even need. So it's not like you can't model these things effectively. You've already done it.
Thank you. Let me ask a couple of questions here that the audience provided, and then I'll go back to our panelists and ask them. What seems the case is that the human mind, as contrasted to other minds, picks up not only on immediate survival-related externals, but picks up external relations in a generative way, that is, production of novelty from environmental affordances with little regard to immediate utility.
That is a perfectly... Yeah, that's a perfectly timed, because that is exactly the argument that Johan Linden and his colleagues make in their book, in their argument, is that you can look at non-human animals and you can explain most everything with chaining, and that's kind of ties you to the environment and keeps you embedded in the environment. And what they say is interesting about humans and distinctive is precisely what was said there, is that humans learn things that they don't need at the time and then have the capacity to sequence those together. So humans have a capacity for sequencing that is different from the chaining that you see in associative learning animals. And we are associative learning animals as well, but we have this capacity for sequencing. And then their argument is this is what makes the difference. But then they do tie that to the fact that you can have things in the world, that you can put things in the world that allow you to then keep track of those things that you need to sequence. So it's not the case that it's necessarily always completely divorced from the world, because we can make things that set up the environment in ways that allow us to achieve those sequencing goals. So I mean, when that book comes out, you're going to really love it. It's really interesting. So I think there is a distinctive difference. And like I say, most other creatures will use the environment to obviate the need to evolve more neural tissue, right? That instead of having a big brain, you exploit the structure of the environment, you save on brain tissue. We are clearly not like that. We have invested in huge amounts of brain tissue and we exploit the environment in these ways. And I think that exploitation of the environment has a deep continuity, but we are doing both. We're using both strategies. And why is it that we, of all animals, need to use both strategies? Maybe it comes back to the variable environment thing that you just raised.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Some people are asking about your slides and the list of books that you mentioned. Just want to tell everybody that the video of the presentation and the PowerPoint will be available on our webpage soon after the seminar. Okay, the next question. Awesome talk. One implication of what you say is that most developmental psychology is misguided. Instead of trying to detect the emergence of representations by devising clever tests to get at what is inside the baby's head, we should be paying more attention to how it waves its arms and legs around and sucks its fingers.
Yes, absolutely. That is very true, Rob. That is exactly what, and then that's what, that is what Esther Thielen spent her career doing. It's what Karen Adolphs spends her career doing now, looking at how babies learn to inhabit their bodies and exploit the environment. So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever looked up Karen Adolph's work. It's fantastic because she spends most of her time pushing babies down very steep slopes and seeing what happens to them. So that's one you can try at home if you've got kids. Feel free. What she does is shows that if you put a baby that can crawl on a very steep slope, it will hesitate but then it will learn how to use it. And if you get a baby that's just learned how to walk, right? You wait until that baby who's learned how to navigate a very steep slope by crawling. If you wait for that baby to learn to walk and then you bring it back to the slope and you put it up the top of the slope and say, right, okay, here's this steep slope. You've seen it before. What are you going to do? That baby rushes headlong down it without hesitation. And she has to kind of grab them before they smash their heads in, because what's happened is they haven't learned about slopes as an abstract, notion of angles and how you have to arrange your body. They've learned how to navigate in a crawling position. And if you want them to learn how to navigate that slope again, they have to learn all over again, because now they're a different creature. The dynamics are completely different. So they're not learning abstract notions of, object permanence and the physics of slopes. They're learning how their body can respond to this kind of slope. So I think if you want to learn about this kind of more less cognitive way of looking at development, look at Karen Adolph's work. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you for this excellent talk. I was wondering what question you think would be more culturally appropriate to ask the Hadza people that would demonstrate their knowledge of causality while using their balls.
That is a very good question. I think what you could ask, and I mean the questions that were asked were in the study, they weren't all sort of very highfalutin necessarily. They were reasonable, good questions. And I think that paper that just came out by Harrison Boyd and on the Hadza understanding of causality is brilliant, right? It's one of my favorite papers that I've read this year so far. What I do think you could do, though, is ask about questions to do with sort of that relate to the affordances. So if and look at how give people the opportunity to use different kinds of bows in action and reveal their knowledge in that way. But if you ask people about affordances, you often get more accurate answers than you do if you ask them about physics, so to speak, because when you ask about affordances, you're asking about ecological physics. So Jeff Bingham, he's a very good, he looked at the size weight illusion. So the size weight illusion is if you have two objects of the same weight, but one is smaller than the other, you perceive the smaller one as heavier. So you have this illusion. But he showed that if you ask people, how far can you throw this? Which of these objects can you throw the furthest? The weight illusion goes away, because then you're really thinking about, what am I going to be able to do? How far can I heft this? And that's a different kind of question. So I think if there was a revisiting of that, that Hadza Bowman were asked questions to do with the specific affordances, like how if we give you this bow, we change this, how far could you shoot? What kind of animal could you catch? How accurate do you think you would be? What would you have to do in a kind of bodily way? I think that would give a better understanding that would be more in line with the understanding most of us have, rather than a kind of high school physics kind of knowledge that we sort of is what we think we should have when we understand causality. But that's not what causality has to be, and it probably hasn't been for most of our evolutionary history.
Thank you. Let me ask our panelists, Marta and Pete, if they have any questions.
I do. I have a question, but it's I'm not sure, it's perhaps very, very strange question, Louise. I love the talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering, so the moment that we have this extraordinary extended cognition, and I didn't know the paper on the industrial energy use and life history, I just thought it's amazing. So it could be that the more that we extend this condition, the less we need that huge a brain, or that we can reach a threshold in which we don't need such a big brain. So it could release the selection for a particularly large brain. And do you think that this could explain the phenomenon that has puzzled anthropologists for a long time, that in the last 10,000 years, our brain in average is smaller than it was before?
Right. I mean, I see Gordon Burkhart's just asked that same question as well. And I think that's something that is worth entertaining, because it's certainly, and it kind of, people have talked about it in terms of like self-domestication hypothesis, because domesticated animals have smaller brains and things like that. But I think this perhaps is a more productive way of looking at it, in the sense of, it may well be, because as soon as you don't need, this is a very expensive machine to run. And as soon as if you can relieve selection pressure on it and still keep going, then perhaps it could be something to do with why you see
and it's not just expensive to run, but obviously there's a threshold in which it compromises the life of the mother. So it has a massive cost having a big brain on 2 dimensions. So if you can offset some of the usefulness of that brain in very much in the ecological sense that you were just talking about, I was thinking of the hands and so on, because at the end we don't invent our tools and our things each time. We just understand ecologically how we can use them and what is their purpose and how we can adjust their use. So we don't need the machinery all the time.
I mean, so Andy Clark says, brains like ours, set the world up so that we can be stupid in peace. And I think that's the kind of, perhaps that is the way to start looking at these kinds of things.
Lovely, Louise. Thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you.
Next question. Is DNA a form of internal representation? How can a theory of mutation and natural selection explain anything in evolution of human cognitive abilities without a distinction between external and internal processes? The environment does not create the organ by itself.
Of course, that's absolutely and utterly true. I'm not sure that DNA, this is the thing. What's it representing? DNA makes proteins, and I think what I would say is that when we think about that, we often think of a kind of, we have these sort of naive blueprint models of those kinds of things. And I think that Robert Sapolsky wrote this popular chapter that is one of the best explanations of why you can't make these kinds of clear internal, external product process divisions, because he talks about, what happens when DNA it makes gene products, it makes proteins. Some of those gene products then come and affect the DNA again and turn on other genes that then make other gene products. So it becomes very difficult to see what's product and what's process, and there is this kind of interplay between these internal and external things. And I think that it's clear that the environment of the cell is itself an environment that the genes are responding to. And so I think it's just this, we have this notion that we have to have something that represents, and that we have to have something that's inside and outside, and we have this interplay between organism environment in these ways. But we don't like to think in terms of how environmental resources can in certain processes be as important, if not more important, than the genes themselves, and that this is there's a kind of back and forth process here. So I'm not denying that you have to have something inside. I'm not denying that brains aren't important. I'm not denying that DNA isn't important. You will not get very far building an organism without genes. You just won't. You won't have any, you won't get very far building a bridge if you don't have a brain. Yeah. But by the same token, if you just put a brain in an engineer's office, that's not going to be very good at building a bridge either, is it? It's just a brain. It doesn't, it can't hold a pencil for a start. So I think we have to sort of think about these ways of nesting, these nested ways of thinking, and not making a sort of division between inside and outside in such a hard and fast way. I'm not sure if that's really answered your question, but I really appreciate it, and I just don't think that we should always think of things as representations unto themselves, because DNA is a representation because we can use it as such. We see the DNA and we see what it produces, and we can make that connection between them. So it is a representation for us. But what's DNA representing to the cell itself? I don't see how it's representing there. And I think that's a mistake we often make. We confuse what it means to be representative.
Thank you. Pete?
Yes. Louise, why do you think humans are such an outlier in brain size? Why did we come to... It seems as if many mammalian lineages have gotten bigger brains over the course of the Cenozoic, but we end up this considerable outlier. How would we explain that?
Well, I mean, I am very taken by those ideas that when you have to, we're long-lived. We are large, long-lived mammals who are going to experience a variety of things through life that you cannot necessarily rely on for sort of like genetic knowledge, if you want to call it that. And you can't rely on the world, the past always being an indicator of the present. And I think that if you have that variation and you're very long-lived, I think you need to have a large pattern recognizer, right? That's what we're really talking about. You need a lot of neural tissue, because lots of neural tissue allows you to be a good pattern recognizer. And the more variable the world is, the more patterns there are that you need to recognize. And I think that what you see in the primates is a sort of a large associative engine that reflects. And I mean, lots of stuff on patterns in primate brain size seem to correlate best with longevity, rather than aspects of particular aspects of social life. I think if you're a long-lived animal, you're going to encounter variety and unpredictability in your environment, and that is going to select for brain size, because you cannot rely on other forms of knowledge to get you through those difficult times. I think the same is true of elephants. Long-lived creatures who are going to experience a variety of conditions throughout their lifespan, which are unpredictable.
Well, some long-lived animals, though, don't have big brains, like Galapagos tortoises live forever and live longer than humans.
How much, what action is going on in their lives, Pete?
I don't know. Humans couldn't get along on the Galapagos Islands without big brains, but tortoises can. So we're all living in the same basic world, and so that is what puzzles me.
Well, I think like the coelacanth hasn't altered very much in a bajillion years or whatever it is. I think that if you have, I think you would need to go away and say, okay, what is the niche of the Galapagos tortoise really like, and how much has it changed? And if it has been very variable, then I would be wrong, and we'd have to start again. But I would be willing to bet that it's not particularly changeable, and they're very good at what they do, and they can carry on doing it without nothing can eat them apart from us, I suppose. But you know what I mean? They kind of have they've got it all sorted out. And I don't think necessarily that niche has been very changeable in the way that the savannas of East Africa were in the Pleistocene.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, there's a comment here about a just published book, The Emotional Mind, by Stephen Asma and Remy Gabriel. That is kind of it's probably.
Yeah, I've read Stephen Asma's previous book, so that looks very good. I'm going to make a note of that. Thank you very much, Burton. That's really handy.
And let me ask you the last question here. I wonder if immunological memory may be a better way of understanding our memory than the kind of storage seen in DNA.
That's an excellent point, Leslie. And I think it is. I think that is the point, because if you think of brains as tracking systems of environments, right, that's what you're doing. You're tracking the environment. And if you think about what's the other highly complicated, massively complicated tracking system that exists, it's the immune system. I think the immune system is even more impressive than the brain in many ways, but that's what it's doing. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we could have a different model, and I think the immune system is a really, really good one. So yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Well,
I see someone's just said about a book list, and I have the book list on there on one of the early slides. I've written a review of all these kinds of ideas of distributed cognitive ecologies and things like that. And so if you would like a copy, just email me and I can happily send it to you, and then you won't have to worry about getting it all off the slide, and you can find out a bit more about the different viewpoints there. So I say that to Sue, who asked that. So I will happily send you a copy, Sue, if you send me an email.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Lou. It's been great. Great talk, great discussion.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and thank you, everybody. And I hope we'll see you again next week when Sarah Matthew will be talking about cultural evolution of cooperation and conflict. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Take care.